Let's take a look at the United States of America. Here are the 50 states that all contain their respective state capitals. And here are the 10 most populated cities in the country. Can you guess how many of these cities are state capitals? The answer is only one: Phoenix, the state capital of Arizona and the 5th most populated city in the US, with about 1,650,000 inhabitants. Phoenix is well centered in Arizona and easily the most populated city in the state, making it a reasonable choice for its capital city. However, is this also the case for other US states? The abnormality of state capitals and their population might surprise you. Of the 50 US states, only 17 have their largest city as the state capital, leaving the remaining 33 with other urban areas that dominate the population. This peculiarity may be known among some Americans, but when we compare this trend to other countries and their states, the same pattern is not nearly as prevalent. Let's take the 20 most populated countries in the world and their subdivisions, whether they're called states, provinces, divisions, regions, federal subjects, prefectures, or governorates, and calculate the percentage of subdivisions where the largest cities are also the capital city. Immediately we can tell how much of an anomaly the United States is, with only about a third of their states meeting the criteria. The next 3 lowest percentages belong to India, Mexico, and the Philippines, but even their states and provinces comfortably meet the criteria over half the time. The remaining 16 countries all lie over the 70% mark, revealing how unusual the situation really is for the United States. In fact, 5 of these countries don't have a single subdivision capital, which is not the largest city in that region. Pakistan's 4 provinces and 2 administrative territories meet the requirement, as well as Bangladesh's 8 divisions and France's 13 administrative regions. Now 6, 8, and 13 states are not nearly as plentiful as the USA's 50 states. That goes out the window when we look at Iran, which is 31 for 31, and Vietnam with an astounding 58 for 58 with its provinces. This means that if you're in the capital of any province in Vietnam, it's guaranteed to be the most populated city in that entire province. But Vietnam may be an outlier. It's not nearly as large of a country as the US, and its provinces are much smaller than the US states. In fact, its largest province is smaller in land area than Hawaii, the USA's 4th smallest state. On the other hand, the USA's largest state, Alaska, is over 100 times larger in land area than Vietnam's largest province, and over 5 times larger in land area than all of Vietnam. With this in mind, let's find a country that's more comparable to the US. Russia, for example, is larger than the US and contains 81 federal subjects. Take a guess how many of these have their largest city as the capital. The answer is almost all of them, 75 out of 81 to be exact. Brazil is another large country that is more similar in size to the US, with 24 of its 26 states following the pattern. Compared to the rest of the world, the US is truly irregular when it comes to this statistic. Let's take a closer look at why this is. Returning to the US, we see the states whose largest city is their capital city don't follow an obvious trend. They are evenly distributed across the US, with some small states like Rhode Island and Massachusetts in the east and some larger states in the west. If we look closer at the states that don't follow our rule, we can notice something between its largest city and state capital. Let's start on the east coast with Maine. Portland is the state's largest city, located on the southwestern shore of the state, and Augusta is the state's capital, located about 50 miles northeast of Portland. New Hampshire is adjacent to Maine, with the largest city, Manchester, close to its southern border. Concord is the state's capital, located about a dozen miles north. Next to New Hampshire is Vermont, with its largest city, Burlington, on the western border, and its capital, Montpelier, further east with only 8,000 inhabitants, making it the least populated state capital. Next we have New York, with its largest city of New York City, located at the southern tip of the state. It's also the largest city in the nation, but interestingly, it is still not the capital of New York. That title belongs to Albany, located over 100 miles north of the megacity. The point is, despite the state's largest city lying in a practical spot, usually near a body of water, the capital city is more centralized in relation to the state's total land area. To really hit this home, Pennsylvania is a perfect example. Philadelphia, the state's largest city and the country's former capital, lies in an ideal spot on the Delaware River, with close access to the Atlantic Ocean. Pittsburgh, the state's second largest city, lies on the opposite side of the state along the Ohio River. Neither of these two cities is Pennsylvania's state capital. It's not even the third largest city in the state, or the fourth, or the fifth, or even the sixth. It's only when we get to the ninth largest city in the state that we finally arrive at the state capital, Harrisburg, probably the most centrally located city out of all of these. Although each state is different from the others and has its own history as to what city the state capital is, having a capital city located centrally allows easier access to it from all sides of the state. Today, this may not be a big deal, but back in the early 19th century, when people's best form of travel was by horse, the location of the state capital was paramount. In addition, a centrally located state capital usually meant it would lie in a more rural part of the state, which ensured that political and economic power would be separated, something that many Americans at the time were in favor of. Given these justifications, there still remain a couple of states that don't clearly follow this centralization rule. One of them is Florida. Tallahassee is the state's capital, located centrally on the longitudinal base. However, on a latitudinal basis, Tallahassee is located very far north, away from some major Floridian metros like Miami, Tampa, Orlando, and Jacksonville. In fact, only 7.5% of the state's population lives in Florida's panhandle. So why is Tallahassee so far away from the action? The answer lies in the early 19th century when Florida was initially in two pieces, West Florida and East Florida, that both belonged to the Spanish. Pensacola was West Florida's capital, and St. Augustine was East Florida's capital. In 1821, both sides became American territory through the Florida Purchase Treaty, with Pensacola and St. Augustine still the two largest establishments of Florida. Delegates from the two former capitals had to travel by boat all around the peninsula to meet with each other, which could last up to 2 months. Eventually, the council members were fed up with the arduous journey and proposed to set up a new place to meet. Tallahassee was thus erected in 1824 as the capital of Florida, almost exactly halfway between the two cities. It wasn't until much later that Florida's population began to expand, and cities on the peninsula were established like Miami, Tampa, and Orlando, giving the illusion that Tallahassee was misplaced. Another outlier is Alaska. Its largest city is easily Anchorage, with over 290,000 inhabitants, equivalent to about 40% of the state's total population, making it a central hub. Surprisingly, it's not the state capital. The state's second largest city, Fairbanks, seems to be potentially more centralized, with a population of only about 32,000 people, over 9 times less than Anchorage. However, it is also not the capital. This title belongs to the third largest city, Juneau, deep in the Alaskan panhandle and far from the mainland. With Anchorage and Fairbanks on the Alaskan mainland and no road connecting Juneau to the mainland Alaska, why on earth is Juneau the state capital? The answer lies in the colonization of Alaska. Russian explorers settled in Sitka way back in 1799. About half a century later, the Russian Empire was involved in the Crimean War, resulting in heavy losses for the Russians. The empire was in a vulnerable political and economic state following the war, and as a result, sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 for a mere $7.2 million, approximately equivalent to $5 per square kilometer at the time, which would be about $90 in today's currency. Another half-century later, in 1906, the capital of the District of Alaska was relocated to Juneau because it was more of a dominant economic area from the Klondike Gold Rush. At this time, Anchorage did not exist yet, and Fairbanks barely existed as a small trading post. Over the years, both cities expanded due to rail, aviation, military, and eventually oil. Given the rise in population of both cities, there were several attempts to move the state capital from Juneau to Anchorage or Fairbanks. By 1974, Alaskan voters approved the relocation of the capital. The obvious choice was Anchorage, but rural Alaskans and Fairbanks residents advocated placing the capital away from the largest city to ensure a balance of power. As a solution to the problem, the small town of Willow was agreed upon to allow easy access from both cities. At the time, Willow had an astonishing population of only 80 people, which would have easily made it the least populated state capital of any major country. However, with so few people and a lack of infrastructure and capital facilities, an estimated $1 billion would be required to fund the transition and construction of necessary buildings. Given the complexity, the move ultimately wasn't worth it, and Juneau has remained the state capital ever since.